First of all, I will try to be very practical today. I, of course, agree with most of things that have been said. But as a canon lawyer, I will in any case try to be as realistic as possible. Some people call to action this morning. I think it's a good idea. And action for me is not the current Pope resigning, as Monsignor Vigano asked lately, because that, of course, would lead to a new Pope, obviously. Then we will have a collection of retired popes. That's also a novelty. But it would lead to a new Pope probably being rather conservative again, whereas the structures that didn't change are in a way a result of the previous popes, not of the current one. So let's not be naive in that regard. Let's not go back to former days. So canon law, it's of course a discipline you all like very much. Most of you have the code of canon law next to your bed for the long nights. I appreciate that. But what I will do is not read my paper. That would be against human rights. But I will just try to make a summary of the main ideas. In the first part, I will tackle some general elements. How can the current canon law culture be reconciled with the Royal Commission's recommendation? That will be a first part. A second part will be the various ways of tackling the issue, through particular law or through universal law. That means the Vatican, as suggested, in fact, by the Royal Commission. And number three will be some key issues, in my eyes, the topics that will truly be at stake when it comes to change of the general system of the Church. And I think it may come to change now, given the pressure, of course, exercised on the Pope and other church leaders. Without pressure, most things don't change. Of course, theology is nice and can be an element for change, but pressure is probably the best theology to come to true changes. And maybe there are more openings now than there used to be in the past. So, I start with my first part, because there is some logic even in canon law. And in the first part, I think we have to try to balance what is already good in canon law with the recommendations as they are formulated by the Royal Commission. Because not everything is bad in current canon law. When we look at the 1983 code, which is the most recent one, then we see that for the first time in the history of the Church, obligations and rights and obligations of Christian faithful were formulated. Before they didn't exist explicitly. And among them is, for instance, the principle of legality. No punishment without a law. In Latin, nullum crimen nulla poena sine lege. There has to be a previous law and a previous penalty scheduled, otherwise you can't punish people. And that's a novelty, because in the 1917 code, it was still possible to punish without a law. Some people said, okay, but if there is a law saying that you can punish without a law, then there is a law, so you don't punish without a law. That's, of course, brilliant. But for people who are, of course, who have to be obedient to that law, it's not the best option. So that novelty, no punishment without the law, is, I think, important, and we should maintain that, even if it's sometimes difficult. I think a good legal culture in the Church is of utmost importance. We were dealing with the Church complying to standards of secular law. That includes also the set of human rights. We should not lower our standards in that regard. A second element, with regard to canon law that in my eyes is positive, is Canon 1313. And that canon says that penal norms are only valid for the future, and for the past only in case they are favorable for the potential criminal. And that's, of course, a very old norm, also present in Roman law, in medieval law, came also into secular law. But I think we should maintain that. It's a matter of general legal culture. So these things, I would like to say, not everything is bad in canon law. And the second element, of course, better procedures are necessary. More transparency, indeed, everybody is pretty much in favor of that. Let's say also more, let's say, accountability. All those elements are very important. And in what follows, I will just try to see how those two elements can be brought into connection with each other. For instance, let's look at a few recommendations in the light of the first point I'm trying to make. One recommendation is number 1613, saying the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference should request the Holy See to amend the imputability test in canon law so that the diagnosis of pedophilia is not relevant to the prosecution of or penalty for canonical offense. Now, in my paper, you can read all the technical details. In my eyes, what matters is not the fact that someone can be punished, because when you are mentally ill, it's possible, then you should not be punished. But what is important is that the victims will not be the victim of the fact that you can't punish somebody technically. That's another story. And that also the treatment of the perpetrator will be so that he can't do it again. So the consequences should in any case be the same, whatever the imputability is. You could say, of course, and that's also true, that in canon law, imputability sometimes is a little bit too easygoing. For instance, when you don't know the law, that may lead to a weaker or a more benevolent punishment. That's most of the time not the case in secular systems. There the principle is everybody is supposed to know the law. It's a presumption and you can't argue against it, even if nobody knows the law ultimately, not even the most brilliant lawyer. But that's the way a system functions. It is true that this imputability system in the church is sometimes a little bit too easy. On the other hand, what truly matters is that the victims are taken care of and that the perpetrator can't continue, whether he is found penally guilty or not. That's, I think, a nuance we should make. And I know it's rather technical ultimately. That's just one element. Another element is prescription. So the Commission is pleading for the abolishment of a possible prescription of crimes of the type we are discussing here. Now, of course, we have to look at that in a context of canon law based upon civil law traditions, where also in Roman law, prescription has a long history. And the idea of prescription is that after a while, after a long time, normalization of a situation is better than the ongoing possibility of people being punished. You can't go on forever. It was like that in many fields, also of civil law. Now, of course, I know that this is today highly debated, that it is not a part of human rights not to have prescription at all, that for some crimes also in the secular world, like crimes against humanity, it is obvious that today there is no prescription at all, but we should at least discuss the issue of prescription. Can it be tolerated after a while or not? I think that's an important issue. If, however, prescription is accepted penally, this does not mean that people or churches cannot be held liable, let's say, civilly within the church, which means that damages can be paid. That's something that should be discussed, debated. I know it's a difficult issue. I'm in any case a little bit hesitant about the way the church describes prescription in the 2010 norms, De delictis contra fidem et de gravioribus delictis. There is mentioned that the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith can derogate from prescription in individual cases. That's, of course, unacceptable. There is prescription or there is no prescription. You can't say for you there is prescription and for you there isn't. That's just unfair, and it shows a little bit also the lack of legal technique among the highest instances in the church. Who could have imagined that? In any case, prescription does not mean, I want to be clear on that, that moral responsibility and even financial responsibility can still exist. There are other techniques for paying the damages, taking administrative measures, and also inviting priests on moral grounds to take up their own responsibility. I just mean by that, canon law has more than just penal law in the church. It has other measures to stop perpetrators. For details, I refer to my paper if you are really, not self-sufficient and well. Then we have the next element that I would like to still see in that first element. So my first point, and this point I'm making here, is try to make a balance between commonly recognized legal standards already accepted by the church and an improvement, but don't take away what we already have. So the system should be sustainable also within a secular realm. That's what I try to say. Another suggestion made is, for instance, there should be norms that suggest in 16.9 there should be made norms so that a new series of canons is created with regard to child sexual abuse. New norms. I'm not opposed to new norms, but of course, the more norms there are, the more things that are not in the norms will not be punished. That's also a difficult thing. Canon 18 of the Code, and it's a general principle, says penal norms have to be interpreted strictly. So if you make a long list and you forget something, then the perpetrator will not be punished. That's just a technical argument. Where I do agree with is that punishment should be possible for all perpetrators. Today in canon law there is still a presumption that only clerics will be in important functions. And for that reason, for instance, only clerics can be suspended as a penalty, not the laity. Now, of course, if you have a layperson who is, for instance, a pastoral worker or a judge in a tribunal, he should be dealt with in the same way as a cleric. But here we are still dealing with the underlying idea that the laity are nice people, very committed, or our partners according to Vatican II, etc., but that they will never be in functions where a possible suspension may be at stake. Another element is, and here I fully agree, the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference should request the Holy See to amend canon law to ensure that the pastoral approach is an essential precondition to the commencement of canonical action. So that pastoral approach, of course, is an element that could also refrain from justice. I mean, pastoral is important, but it can never mean that you don't come to an entire system of justice that is acceptable to all. So I remember when I was a young canon lawyer, some people said, look, the church is a community of very nice people, and that's of course true, it's still like that. But it means that law is in fact not a way to solve things. We don't need too much law, let's go for a pastoral approach. But very often that meant that those in power could act in a discretionary way and could use law if they like to, could also try to avoid it. I think that's certainly not the good way. Indeed, justice is the minimum before we can really talk about a true pastoral approach. And that remains an important element. There are still other elements, but I'm not going to mention them all. Some have been mentioned in the past, like, for instance, the dismissal from the priesthood, the laicization. Yesterday, it has already been said that there are pros and cons. Pro is, it's of course the hardest possible punishment. Contra is the fact that the person in question is out of control and might be or become a perpetrator as a citizen. But of course, the results may be similar. So far, some elements. And just to sum up again, I just wanted to make clear that we have to do two things. On the one hand, prevail a system of canon law that accepts fundamental rights and that comes along with secular standards of human rights, and then an improvement, of course, of the already existing system. That was point one. Now I come to, surprisingly, the second point. And that second point deals with the recommendation of the Royal Commission not to make recommendations for changes to particular canon law for Australia, but rather to seek clarification or reform of certain issues at the level of universal law. And universal law means the Vatican, the Pope. Of course, that's ambitious. Australia invading Rome, it never happened before. But why not? Why not? They will be surprised over there. There are some arguments, I think, in favor of not focusing too much on particular law. The first element is, particular law is to some extent powerless, as Canon 135 paragraph 2 says, that a particular law can never go against a universal one. So you can do certain things, and of course good practices are perfectly possible, but the system cannot be changed as such from the bottom. That is true, that's a reality. This being said, of course, individual bishops can cope with new standards, can have a lot of personal responsibility, can be the best bishops of history or whatever, but there is that limitation. A second limitation is also that there are structural limits in general to particular law. For instance, Canon 1317 of the Code, learn it by heart, says particular law cannot establish a penalty or of dismissal from the clerical state. So you can't do that. A particular legislator cannot issue a new norm, for instance, saying that the perpetrator will be punished with laicization. That can only be done by a universal norm, with all the consequences it entails. One of the reasons is, of course, underlying, and it's not without reason, that a bishop could issue a law to eliminate his enemies with a particular penalty. No, dismissal from the clerical state goes very far, the end of incardination, etc., but it cannot be done. So what I intend to say is simple. It is very difficult to do a lot starting from particular law. Then, of course, universal law is probably better. If the Pope changed things, he's very powerful in the Church, Canon 331, we already heard about that. If the Pope changed things, fine. But then again, he doesn't do so easily. He doesn't do so easily. This being said, the current Pope has already made many more changes than his two predecessors, Benedict XVI and John Paul II. That's also true. But when you discuss matters, and that will be one of my final points later, when you discuss matters in Rome, then pseudo or real theological arguments always come in again. Arguments dealing with natural law, divine law, theological impossibilities. And I think that will be one of the key issues. So I'm certainly in favor of changes in universal law, but we will need good arguments to counterbalance longly established ideas on certain issues, and I will enumerate them briefly later on. A third solution, the third way, it's always something nice between communism and capitalism, also between universal law and particular law. The third way, which is not useless, is trying to make so that universal law grants more possibilities to particular law. Because very often the argument for not changing universal law is, well, if we do not find the approval of most of the people in the world, we don't do it. So the universal character leads then to a kind of conservative attitude saying, okay, we are ready for it, but in Asia and China is not following, and what about Congo? And we see some difficulties in Germany, etc. So that universal character is sometimes an issue, and maybe we should come to more matters left to, well, episcopal conferences, for instance, but then, of course, well-equipped episcopal conferences with excellent bishops and very difficult also, excellent canon lawyers. It's not an easy thing, but we should maybe try to foster that. I think for certain issues, like, for instance, compulsory celibacy, or a more difficult issue theologically, but important, the position of women, female ordination, well, we could try to go into that direction. If you want to achieve on these issues a universal consensus, that will take a long time. Even our grandchildren may still be busy discussing those issues. Now, an interesting problem in that regard, and I evoke it quickly, is here again, many people will say divine law is involved. And that issue of divine law will be truly one of the problems. Now, some canon lawyers already discussed that, in my eyes, in an intelligent way, including Helmut Prey. You probably don't know him. The non-canon lawyers don't know him. He is an Austrian who has been teaching for long years in Germany. And he made a list of norms of divine law that ultimately didn't remain of divine law. To put it a bit more clearly, God changed his mind. And I think that's an interesting thing, because it shows that that's the way how it happens. He mentioned, for instance, the goal of marriage. It was for a long time procreation and education of children. It was perceived as part of divine law, everybody said so, and Vatican II just changed that. Also, the well-being of the spouses was the first goal, together with procreation and education. It's one of the many examples, but it also means don't take divine law too seriously, because God himself is very often less concerned than those who want to maintain their power. So that's an element we have to be aware of. And I will just add one thing on that. Pope John Paul II, in 1994, wrote his apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, just after he fell down in the bathroom, but that's really, that's merely coincidence. And in that letter he said that it was part of the divine ordination of the church that women cannot be ordained to the priesthood. It was said like that for the first time in the history of the church. Before, there was said, it is putatur, supposed to be of divine law, which means God is still slightly hesitating. But then the Pope in 1994 said, it is part of divine law, divine ordination. Now, why did he say that at that moment? Because briefly before that, the Church of England decided to ordain women priests. So it is a strategic move very often. And of course, if you invoke divine law, further argumentation can be left aside. And that's a difficulty in any case. So far, the three levels. And I will end with my last part. What are, in my eyes now, the real issues that should change in the church? The real issues to change the system. And that should be also discussed with the Pope, or at least with the official canon lawyers that are working for him and who change their mind easily. That's what I saw when you have a new Pope. then they start thinking and rethinking what they thought in a completely other way. A first element has already been evoked, is the so-called separation of powers. And Canon 135 of the Code says that there are three different powers. That power in the church is distinguished into executive, legislative, and judicial power. But that's the issue. It's only a technical distinction. It's not a balance or separation, because all those powers are held by the Pope universally, Canon 331, and by the bishops in a particular church, 318. It's only an operational distinction with some consequences, for instance, for delegation of powers and other things, but basically there is that unity of power. And here the question is, should it remain like that? In my eyes, obviously, no, because we need independent tribunals, and I hope with lay people in it. So at least to balance the almost limitless power of the bishops. But what is the argument to maintain the old system? One should always know the argument of the others. The argument is, very often, look at the apostles. They were not hampered by a separation of powers. And indeed, they lived long before Montesquieu and all kinds of theories of separation. And that is even mentioned in important commentaries, like, for instance, the Pamplona commentary. It is like that because of the nature of the church. And here we come very close to divine law arguments. Even if you would like to change it, you can't do it. Because by changing it, you would betray the situation of the apostles. Bishops would be different in their action from what the apostles did. So that's an argument in my eyes that is very important. We should advocate that the position of the bishops is by no means weakened by independent judges. It's even reinforced because the legal character of their acts will be at least confirmed that way. But it's an issue. It's one of the main issues. The second issue is Canon 129, already mentioned also. The power of governance and the power of organization go hand in hand in the church. You have to be ordained to have power of governance. And that was brought together again during Vatican II. The canon, by the way, was formulated in this direction through the intervention of two important cardinals of the past, Basilium and Joseph Ratzinger. They formulated the canon in that way because previously, in a former draft, there was some room for true participation of lay people, not just cooperation. But they made things right again, a person later becoming a pope. Now here again, the question is this divine law, yes or no? Can we change it or not? And that will be truly the argument. Ultimately, when it comes to changes. And here the answer is, it is no divine law. Because already in the code currently, there are exceptions. Lay people can be judges, even if they are only members of a college of 3 people, but they have honorary power, because it is power linked to their office, as the late Jim Provost demonstrated clearly. And another canon lawyer, Urrutia, who passed away, but he was professor at the Gregorian, said, this is clearly a norm that is not divine, otherwise there would be no exceptions. But let's try to make that clear, so that the power of governance can be shared, and that lay people, especially I'm thinking of the executive power, but more even the judicial power, the fact whether or not the bishop is trespassing his own or other norms. There, at least, lay people should play a part. All kinds of lay people, because there are also problems today. I know some bishops, I have also other bad friends, but I know some bishops who say, okay, if I can appoint a lay person, I will always appoint a woman. Very nice. but what about laymen? They just are abandoned. So we should come to a system where certain functions are just open, more functions, and at the same time ordination is available to all. Here we come to a kind of emergency reaction by bishops, which is not helpful. A third element that also plays a part, so I mentioned already 135 and 129, is the still surviving idea of perfect society in the church. That's a very amazing thing. Perfect society, just to be clear, doesn't mean that the church is perfect. But it means that it can be fully autonomous, that it doesn't need any help from secular instances to run its system. That's the basic idea. Well, in that idea, we see that first of all, it has been developed in the 18th century by people like Mr. Rautenstrauch, a very beautiful name, who was opposed to all kind of Protestants' way of thinking, where the Protestants more easily accepted functioning within a state system as a church, but being obedient to and compliant to the norms. That was not the idea of Mr. Rautenstrauch. And we can also say that the perfect society thinking was really at its summit after the loss of the Vatican States. So when, as a result of the unification of Italy in 1871, the Pope lost temporary power, then it became even more important to become, of course, a perfect society. You try to become what you are not as a result of all those things. Now, the nice thing of the perfect society is that in theory, nobody believes in it anymore. It has not been formulated again in Vatican II. That notion is not mentioned any longer. But if we look at the Code of Canon Law, then we see that it still is present, at least implicitly, and in some norms you could say it still is there explicitly. A good example is the famous Canon 22 of the Code, where indeed is mentioned that the Code of Canon Law can refer to secular law, but not when it goes against canon law, and in any case, it remains optional. So there you see still the image of the old perfect society. And I think a new vision on the interaction between secular law and canon law is not a kind of competition between both systems, because I think that was also the 19th century image. That was also the underlying idea when it came to the Societas Perfecta theory, but a kind of interaction. Maybe to give a clear example, when it comes to labor law, then you can, in a labor law contract, include certain canonical elements, making sure that the nature of the church or whatever is protected. It is a kind of subtle interaction instead of a kind of competition and rivalry between two systems. There are other elements that can play a part and are very important. They are in my paper, for instance, the selection of bishops. One word about that. The code in Canon 377 formulates some criteria, but maybe forgets the most important of all in my eyes, moral courage. A bishop has to be courageous, has to take sometimes difficult decisions, has to be able to live with pressure, has to accept that he will not always be loved. And that's a difficulty for many bishops. Because in countries like my own Belgium, but look also at Ireland and others, well, with the Catholic majority for a long time, they were indeed, once they became bishops, they were heroes. Whatever they said and whatever they did. Well, today, in the current climate, they need to be different people, convinced of what they believe, but courageous enough not only to survive, but also to be very present and useful for current society. So far what I wanted to say, just to sum up, for those who rightly didn't listen until now, A few elements. Firstly, some structural changes in canon law are absolutely necessary. In universal law, a true separation of powers and room for power of governance for lay people are of utmost importance, and there should be more space for particular legislation. Secondly, what are the barriers in canon law to change the system? Well, it's easy. It is never easy to give up power. Never. Also for those governing the universal church. But what makes me hopeful is the idea that some church leaders may lose everything in case they don't adapt themselves to standards of law and new criteria. So that makes me, in a way, hopeful. And thirdly, the relationship between civil and canon law is one of collaboration, of working together on specific points. This requires full recognition of human rights with respect for both legal systems, without the church being exempted from the laws of the state. But when the church invokes, let's say, conscientious objection, it will be more easily accepted when it complies with the global system. Thank you very much for listening.